Economic crisis, radical analysis, and radical responses, because you've got to have both. And we have an interesting program, and so far there are no changes in the program. So we welcome everyone here and hope you enjoy the conference. If you have any questions, please feel free to come to the registration table and we'll be happy to answer anything. So I'm Patty Quick and I'm on the URPE Steering Committee and I teach at St. Francis College. And let me introduce to you Dr. Julio Guado, who is also teaches at the college and is also on the URPE Steering Committee.
Thank you. Good morning. Yes, my name is Julio Guado. I'm a member of the Steering Committee of URPE and also an associate professor of economics here at St. Francis College. And as a member of the Steering Committee of URPE, I would like to thank St. Francis College for opening its doors to this URPE conference. And as a St. Francis College representative, I want to say you're welcome. I just want to make a little technical note. There is at least one crew video recording at least some of the presentations and the speeches. And upon the request, I would like to just ask the audience and the presenters, the speakers, to be mindful of that. I think you have watched videos on the web, and you know that when there is a crowd, noise tends to be a problem. Talking about videos on the web, I think you're probably familiar with the lectures that David Harvey has on YouTube, his lectures on Marxist Capital. It's a great honor for me to introduce distinguished professor of anthropology from the City University of New York, David Harvey. I think most of you are familiar with his work as a scholar in geography, in social theory. His books, Limits to Capital and A Brief History of Neoliberalism, come to mind quickly. And also his consistent support for the struggles of working people all over to exercise control over their working and living conditions. So here's Professor David Harvey.
Yeah, what I wanted to do was to ask the following question. What can Marxian theory tell us about the current crisis, and what can the current crisis tell us about Marxian theory of crisis? And in thinking that through, I found myself actually over several years actually beginning to depart somewhat from some of the formulations of crisis theory that were laid out, particularly towards the end of the 1960s and 1970s, and the competing strains of thought which existed amongst Marxists as how to think about crisis formation. And what I did was to start to think in a somewhat more fluid way, I think, about how crises come about and where they come from. And when the current mess broke out, it seemed to me this was a very appropriate moment to see in what ways the ways of thinking that I was following would actually help us understand what is going on. Now, the basis of this actually arises out of some passages in the Grundrisse, which are, I think, very interesting because it talks about the relationship between capital and limits. And just to sort of paraphrase very oversimplistically, the argument that Marx makes is that in the same way that nature cannot abide a vacuum, capital cannot abide limits. And that therefore one of the things that the history of capitalism has been about is encountering limits, turning those limits into barriers, and then circumventing them or transcending them in some way. And if you start to look in the Grundrisse as to how these limits are constituted and where they lie, they sort of lie all over the place in the Grundrisse, but it seemed to me that one of the ways in which you could formulate this is to go to the sort of standard way in which capital circulates, and to look at that circulation process and ask at each point in that circulation process, is there a potential barrier, is there a potential limit at this point? And the standard process with which I work and which is laid out in Capital is the idea that capitalists start the day with a certain amount of money. They go into the marketplace and they purchase labor power, and they purchase means of production. They select an organizational and technological form, and then they go into a labor process and they create a new commodity which is then sold in the market for more money than they started out with. And then the more money, of course, is the profit or the surplus value, and then part of that always gets recapitalized for reasons which are a little bit complicated, but always gets recapitalized into an expansion of the system. So the capitalist system is expansionary. And if you look historically and you look at the data from Angus Maddison or something like that, you'd see that historically capitalism has expanded at around 2.25% per year since around 1750 or so. And if you go to the financial press or you listen to financial commentators, you'll find most of them saying, well, 3% growth rate is, pretty much okay. More than that is really very good. Less than 3%, you start to say things are getting sluggish. If it's down to 1%, you say this is really getting bad. And of course, you're 0%, it's crisis. So what this means is that capitalism has to expand at a compound rate over time, which means that over time you need more and more outlets to be found for the recapitalization of the surplus value produced yesterday. Right now, if you want to get back to a 3% growth rate, you've got to find investment opportunities for about $1.5 trillion globally. Back in 1970, you were talking about $0.5 trillion. If we continue the compound rate of growth, by the time you get to 2050, you're going to be talking about $3 trillion of reinvestment for which you have to find profitable outlets. So this compounding rate of growth is in itself a problem, and it suggests that there may inherently be some kind of limit emerging there as to the possibility to absorb the surpluses which are being produced. And this produces what I call the capital surplus absorption problem, the capital accumulation problem. Where is it going to go? Put in physical terms, if you thought about 3% compound rate of growth in, say, 1780, when market capitalism was sort of about Manchester, Birmingham, London, and a few other hot spots, that's one thing. When you think about 3% compound rate of growth on everything that's going on in China, much of the Soviet Union and the ex-Soviet Empire, and of course all of Western Europe, North America, and much of Latin America, you're really talking about a pretty enormous kind of reinvestment problem which is going to be faced. And therefore going back over the different barriers that might exist is a very interesting way to look at that capital surplus absorption problem. So let's look at the different moments and think about them. The first moment is the money moment. Where does the initial money come from? Now, in Capital, Marx tends to sort of say, well, that's primitive accumulation, and you start out with that, and that's that. But actually, it's much more complicated than that, and even in the theory, even in the account of primitive accumulation, you find that Marx starts talking about, in effect, what I would call the formation of a state finance nexus, which is terribly, terribly important for, if you like, assembling a lot of the money, trading debt, particularly national debt, and having the capacity to assemble capital in the requisite amounts in the right places and at the right time. In other words, if you go back to the Saint-Simonian view, that it's very important for capital to actually associate capitals and to take all those little bits of surpluses that are produced here and there and bring them together in some way, then that means that the money moment at the beginning of this whole thing really requires a fairly sophisticated financial system to assemble all of that money and to be able to distribute it and utilize it in some way. And throughout the history of capitalism, what we've seen are periods of crisis out of which comes a major reconfiguration of financial institutions and the means by which capital is assembled and dispersed and distributed and utilized. Now, one of the problems with the way in which Marx is usually read is that Marx tends to view credit and interest as a derivative problem in relationship to the production of the surplus, so that the discussion of the credit system gets delayed to volume 3. But again, in the Grundrisse, he talks about the way in which we should be thinking about distribution which affects production, and the way the distributional moment has a key role to play in the organization of production. And so from my standpoint, I would kind of argue that actually we should revise the usual way in which Marx is presented and take this money moment at the front of this process and treat it as a crucial moment where if the financial institutions are not adequate to the task, then indeed you can get a barrier which needs to be overcome through financial innovation, through new structures, and in the end, of course, new structures which are going to be global financial architectures and so on, and that in the history of capitalism, these new systems, including things like formation of stock market and the formation of the corporation system and all the rest of it in the 19th century, all of these innovations have to be looked at very carefully. And of course the other side of it is that to the degree that a good deal of political as well as economic power is located in those financial institutions, they can demand their ounce of flesh right up front. And so actually this then becomes, as it were, when Marx talks about the way in which independently financial institutions and the structures can extract so much in the way of surplus that in fact they can force a crisis. So this first moment then is a crucial moment that has to be put in there as an element where you can indeed find crises forming, and those crises can of course jeopardize the whole flow of capital and the whole process of recapitalization. Now, there are several accounts which, right now, which concentrate on this and treat financial crises at the center of the current debacle. For instance, Peter Gowan, in one of the last things he wrote, in effect, sort of said, well, that's where we have to look for understanding the current mess. It's inside of the financial system. Towards the end of the article, he says, well, there are some underlying issues here which we also need to address, but much of the article in the New Left Review is taken out with kind of saying, okay, it's a financial problem that is the real barrier here, and that therefore we have to explain this crisis very much by looking at what is happening at that moment and in the financial moment. So that's the first area. The second area, which I don't want to talk about because I'm sure, to this audience, because obviously you'll be incredibly familiar with it, is of course the question of labor. And if there's a scarcity of labor, wages go up. If labor is too well organized, there's all of those kinds of things. So the labor market is actually a potential barrier. And of course, out of this idea comes the view, much more complicated, of course, but there is a view that we should be really talking about profit squeezes, which arise out of, as it were, the relation between capital and labor, mainly in the labor market. Now, there are many people, I think, who looking back into the 1960s, 1970s would say, well, the labor market was indeed the center of the crisis at that time. There was too much political organization of labor. Capital was sort of having to fight off that political organization, and there were certain scarcities emerging. And the question was how to address those scarcities. So in the 1960s, you start to get the guest labor programs. In this country, you get the 1965 overhaul of the Immigration Act, which allowed kind of access to the whole world. So you try to solve it by immigration. You brought the Maghrebians into France, the Turks into Germany, the Yugoslavs into Sweden, and of course the British drew upon their empire. But immigration is a troublesome way to do it because it stirs up all kinds of, factionalism within the working class and popular resistance and so on. So you try to find other ways to do it. And of course, one of the big answers came with the revolution in transport relations that really relied upon a very simple innovation, which everybody forgets about, which is called containerization, which began in the 1960s and allowed eventually, by the time you get to the 1980s, for us to be talking about a global car and a global television set and the possibility of offshoring and all the rest of it, which of course is another way of giving capital access to global labor supplies. And then of course there was a question of technological change, which also started to spur onwards and create unemployment by technologically induced unemployment. And then of course finally you have the political apparatus with Pinochet and Reagan and Thatcher and all the rest of it, whose mission is in fact to destroy the political power of Labour and all of the institutions that surround them, including of course Labour parties and all the rest of it. So the Labour question is a big potential barrier, and historically capitalism occasionally encounters that, but then actually subsequently finds ways to get around it and overcome it. Right now, I don't see anybody saying that the big issue right now is the labour question. Not in this way. There's a way in which labour does come into it, but not in this particular, in this particular moment. Do we find anybody arguing, hey, we're in a big profit squeeze situation? So in effect, the profit squeeze, which looked like it was a sort of a good way to look at it in the work of Andrew Glynn and all of that at the end of the 1960s, doesn't resonate too well right now. The third area of tension is access to means of production. Now, there are two issues here. One is, and I think that the whole kind of question of how capital that's expanding is going to find sufficient means of production means that the means of production have to be produced before the expansion occurs. Now, how that gets coordinated through market signals and so on is really, really problematic. And one of the, I think, clever things that Marx did at the end of Volume 2 was to talk about the imbalances that could arise between production of wage goods and production of means of production. And to say that actually this is a very complicated thing, and therefore you're always faced with the possibility of crises of disproportionality. And these crises are bubbling along all of the time. You never know where you're going to get bottlenecks here, bottlenecks there. And the problem, of course, was largely that in Marx's analysis at least, the coordinations were occurring through the market. But what happens these days is most corporations don't go through the market in terms of their means of production. They use filière systems, they use command kind of systems to all of their parts and their suppliers. So they don't actually go out in the market and look for means of production. They kind of order their means of production, and they know how much they want for next year. So they actually deal with this problem of coordination through the market by setting up, as it were, command and control flow systems, which allow that this question of disproportionality to be some degree addressed. But that doesn't always work, and so therefore there are indeed many aspects of disproportionality that periodically bubble up, and you often find that the state then becomes involved in trying to resolve those bottlenecks and deal with those bottlenecks. So this is, if you like, a perpetual problem. But the big problem that lies behind it is of course, the one which is that means of production, eventually you have to encounter the kind of question of the relation to nature and what the relation to nature is all about. Now, again, historically, the question of limits in nature has been kind of, again, jumped up again and again and again historically throughout the history of capitalism. And actually, throughout that history, you'd have to say that capitalism has been pretty sophisticated in the way in which they've encountered those limits and turned them into barriers and transcended them. Which is not to say that for a certain period you don't have sort of major blockages occurring. And just because capital has historically managed, if you like, the relation to nature in such a way that it can get what it wants out of nature, which is not necessarily to say that's good for nature or good for human beings, but nevertheless it can get what it wants and what it needs out of nature. Just because it's done it in the past doesn't mean it's going to be able to do it in the future. And right now, of course, we are faced with a situation in which many people would argue that part and parcel of the distress right now has a lot to do with limits with natural limits and the barriers of natural limits. And this particularly comes out in areas like climate change, but also, you'll find people talking about peak oil, and you'll find all of those kinds of issues coming up. So there is, if you like, in the present conjuncture, a very strong kind of element of natural limits, which is being, sort of integrated into the discussion, as indeed was the case back in the 1970s. After all, 1970 was Earth Day and all the rest of it, and and there was this is when that literature on limits to growth came out, and people were really starting to be concerned about it. And it seemed like this was a very serious problem. By the time you get to 1980, a lot of it's faded away and nobody thinks about it too much anymore, and now it erupts again. And so there's an interesting kind of question of how we should be thinking about these limits. Is this yet another bout of there being limits of some kind? And there's always been a danger in this whole discussion of attributing, as it were, what is a social phenomenon to limits in nature. And this trade-off that sometimes exists that kind of says, well, the problem isn't really lie with capitalism. It really lies with the fact that it's a Malthusian kind of argument. This is a difficult argument to think of, but it's something that is very much, I think, it seems to me, in the contemporary discussion, and something that needs to be really clearly thought about in very seriously. Because, as I say, just because this was a problem that was overcome in the past, say in the 1970s, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be overcome as easily this time. So there is, if you like, that potential barrier to look at. There is then the question of what organizational forms and what technologies can capital adopt, and are those organizational forms and technologies adequate to the continuation of capital accumulation? Are there technological and organizational blockages in this system? Again, capital has been very sophisticated about these kinds of things and very adaptive, as it were, to these questions, and to the degree that it's gone to, say, subcontracting systems, and to the degree that it's gone to more decentralized models of organization, and to the degree that it's got new technologies like, electronic technologies and so on. There has been, if you like, a very, very considerable radical reconfiguration of technological and organizational forms over the last 30 years. And the big issue right now is to what degree do those technological and organizational forms actually lie at the root of many of the current difficulties. And there are some people who I think would argue that the way in which these organizational forms and technologies have evolved have actually created a kind of real, clear problem. And I think the best way to put that is, again, to contrast with what this problem was in the 1960s or 1970s. In the 1960s or 1970s, many people on the left would actually describe the situation as a situation in which there was monopoly capitalism. Or if you were in France, people would talk about state monopoly capitalism. And the argument here was that actually it's become so monopolized and so, that it's going to lead us into stagnation. This is the sort of Sweezy kind of Steindl line as the theory of stagnation. And I think there's a good deal of evidence that at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, that argument was very strong, which was, I think, very important, because if you go back to Marx's theory of relative surplus value, the development of new technologies depends very much upon the coercive laws of competition being able to do their part. And if the coercive laws of competition are no longer working because you've got strong monopoly power, then lack of competition becomes a real kind of problem. And in many respects, the reforms of neoliberalism in the 1970s were about trying to introduce higher and higher levels of competition. And to the degree that competition became international, of course, this then exercised a very considerable disciplinary force. And the technologies that were coming online in Japan and West Germany, as it was at that time, posed a very serious challenge to the United States. And of course, what we've seen over the years is the way in which the automobile industry in this country has had such a hard time adapting to those levels of competition. When it was in monopoly situation as it was towards the end of the 1960s. I mean, autos was the kind of area that Sweezy and would talk about, and Brown and Sweezy would talk about as being classic kind of monopolization, oligopoly form of organization. That all breaks down in the 1970s, 1980s. And so there are many people around right now who I think would start to say that the problem right now is excessive competition. And that excessive competition, there are frantic attempts to try to limit it, that competition, in all sorts of ways by attempting monopolization strategies, oligopolistic strategies, particularly in pharmaceuticals and energy and all the rest of it. So there's a struggle, if you like, over organizational form going on within capitalism. And I think what we're seeing, for example, if Wall Street is anything to go by, is that we're going to see us coming out of this crisis with a great deal more monopolization than we went into it. And that therefore, if you like, curbing what historically has always been called ruinous competition. When the capitalists start bleating about ruinous competition, what they're looking for is they want the state to come in and protect them, or they want to be allowed to go monopolize as much as they can. So the technologies and the organizational form, then, it seems to me, do have a very important role to play right now, and we should be looking very carefully at that technological and organizational form and what role that is playing, and to what degree ruinous competition lies at the root of many of the problems. Of course, ruinous competition is now not put in the way it was in, say, the 1890s or the 1870s. It's talked about as well as ruinous competition. It's a Chinese or whatever it is. It's unfair competition from East and Southeast Asia or wherever. That is put mainly in those terms. So we're going to get demands, if you like, for some protection against ruinous competition, and probably the protection is more likely to be kind of on the international trade front than it's likely to be internal to a particular economy such as that of the United States. So the organizational and technological form is very important. The next area in the process is the labor process itself. Discipline on the shop floor. Again, back in the 1960s, 1970s, with the shop stewards movements and with the sort of workers' councils and things like that, this was a big issue. And this was the time when the autonomista movement started to kind of really push very hard. And capital was having a real hard time exercising discipline on the shop floor. And out of that came, it's sort of a bit quaint now. The capitalists were trying to sort of co-opt workers by production circles and calisthenics and all kinds of things, But labor discipline was a big issue towards the end of the 1960s, end of the 1970s. Today, however, labor discipline, again, is a very patchy thing, but it's effectively you've got so much access to different, global labor forces right now that you can generally find some place in the world where there's a labor force which is fairly easily disciplined, either as in China by the party apparatus, which is pretty ruthless in the way in which it also helps corporations and enforces labor discipline, or by utilization of all kinds of cultural stratagems. And this is where, on the shop floor, frequently the mobilization of gender and race discriminations and all the rest of it becomes very, very significant in terms of trying to structure labor discipline in such a way that capitalists almost have total power. I don't see the labor discipline issue right now being in the forefront in the way it was, say, in the 1960s, 1970s. I see it as being, a troublesome, it's always a perpetually troublesome thing, but it's not the big issue that is really forcing the difficulty. So then we have the final part in the thing, which is how, where are you going to sell your commodity, and this is effectively the effective demand problem, which produces, if you like, a particular theory of crisis, which is very strong in certain circles in the 1970s, which is the underconsumption theory of crisis, traced back to Rosa Luxemburg and all the rest of it. Well, here we have, in fact, something that's really very interesting. After 30 years of wage repression, working class incomes have not increased at all. And that's pretty much true globally as well as in the United States. Now, the big problem with that is that, if you actually reduce working class incomes are stagnant, then you've got the problem of where on earth are you going to sell your surplus product to. And the answer, of course, in large degree, particularly in this country, was, well, we invent ATM machines and credit cards and create a debt economy. And in fact, you cover the gap between what the real purchasing power of labor is and what it's actually doing simply by expansion of indebtedness. So you get a tripling of indebtedness, not only in this country, but also in many European countries, particularly Britain and Spain and Ireland and all the rest of it. So actually, the debt economy becomes absolutely crucial. Now, there's something interesting here. As I said, the debt economy is, and the credit economy is operating at the front of this whole kind of process. It's also operating at the back of it. And the most glorious way in which you see this is, of course, in housing markets. That actually developers borrow money from the banks to build the buildings, and then the banks then lend money to people, whether they have credit or not, to buy the housing. So in fact, they operate both on the supply and the demand for housing, and they did that very successfully. In fact, in some cases, it was the same institution, which would simply kind of, the developers would borrow the money, they'd build the housing, and then the institution would go off to people and say, hey, you want to buy this housing? We'll lend you the money to get it. So you get this sort of this kind of flow. I would argue that, in fact, there has been a growing effective demand problem in the global economy, and this is a very complicated thing. But it's largely been papered over by the fact that the credit culture has taken very, very strong hold in many of the advanced capitalist economies, so that we now are in a situation, and this is very different from the world in which Marx lived, where about 70% of economic growth in this country depends upon consumerism. And if consumer confidence flags, which is why everybody goes and looks at the consumer confidence surveys, if consumer confidence it becomes a real problem. And it would be a real problem if there was, for example, a credit card strike. If everybody refused to use their credit cards for about a week, the whole of capitalism would be in really serious, dire straits. And so this is, if you like, one of the issues that is arising right now. And again, but this is a very complicated kind of question, and I'm not going to be able to go into it anywhere near the details I would like to. But the effective demand problem is very much there. Now, what this says is this, that actually, if you look at the situation back in the 1970s, you would say there were different barriers that existed, very different barriers. And the key ones were different from those they are today. And what this says to me is that the typical way in which we might approach crisis formation under capitalism, by kind of some theory of the falling rate of profit or profit squeeze or underconsumption or something like that, is fundamentally flawed. That what we should be looking at are notions of limits and barriers, and make the observation, which I think is crucial, that capitalism, and I'm going to sort of take a saying of Engels and turn it into something else, that capitalism never solves its crisis problems, it simply moves them around. You've got a labour problem, you solve the labour problem, you create an effective demand problem. You've got an effective demand problem, you go to the finance, and you've got a financial problem. How do you get out of that one? Well, you go back to the labour question or something like that. I mean, what Keynes did in the 1930s was to say it's lack of effective demand amongst workers that's one of the big problems. So you've got to re-empower the working class, both politically and, of course, economically, because that's the only way you're going to get out of the slump. So if we start to think about crisis tendencies in these terms, which is to say it's being moved around, then one of the things we have to do in every given conjuncture is to say, where's it gone now? Where are the key moments where it is now? And by taking those key moments, then it seems to me politically, strategically, we can start to kind of figure out what a left strategy should be for intervention in relationship to all of this. Now, what this also says is that this notion of the relation, theoretically, this notion of the relation between the production of surplus value and the distribution of surplus value in the form of interest, that they are not, as it were, hierarchically structured. They are actually dialectically integrated with each other. And unless you're prepared to take that dialectical integration, you're going to miss, it seems to me, one of the major forms in which crises get configured. Now, so if you like, that's the way in which I'm thinking about crises these days. But there's another moment here, and in which case some of you have probably groan and say, oh, well, here he goes again. He's a geographer. What else is he going to talk about? Well, actually, the production of space and the production of place and the production of new environmental configurations. How does that go on? And actually, how much of the surplus has been absorbed over the last 50 years through urbanization and through the production of new spatial configurations and investments? How much of it was absorbed by suburbanization in the 1950s, 1960s? And this is, if you like, this brings us to another category, which again gets reduced to something that's derivative rather than fundamental, which is the category of rent. What is it that actually gets gained through urbanization? Well, surplus gets produced by the workers sort of building the house and all this kind of stuff. But what the developers do is, of course, to go to property prices and rents. Now, some very interesting data just coming out, being compiled in the British case, which shows from about the 16th century onwards, far more money was made out of increasing land values and increasing rental than was ever made out of Manchester industrialism, which explains something which I've always had a problem with about British history. All this stuff was going on, extraction of value in the factories is going on in Manchester and all that kind of stuff. But where is the wealth really, really growing? In London. And what is it growing around? It's growing around rental extractions. So this notion, when Marx talks about class formation and says the landlord's there, it erupts at the end, and he always talks about the landlord having a critical role to play. It's not a passive residual role, it's an active role engaged in the production of space, the production of urbanization, and the rest. And in fact, more and more we've been moving towards a sort of rentier economy in which over this last 10 years and 15 years in particular, it's been land values and it's been rental appropriations and property values that have been at the center of capital accumulation. And this is nothing new, because if you go back to the Japanese case, this was what's going on in the 1980s, and it was when the land market crashed in 1990 that the Japanese depression began. The Nordic banking crisis around the same time was attached to property problems. We had our own savings and loan crisis, remember? And these are big issues which have to be integrated into our understanding of crisis. And this time around, where is the crisis located? It's been in the subprime mortgage market, and it's been actually in subprime mortgage markets. If you took away California, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida, we'd be nowhere near in the big mess we're in. That is where a lot of it got concentrated. It got concentrated in an urbanization kind of process of a certain sort. Before that, a lot of this was going on in the older cities. So that in places like Cleveland, much of the African American community had already lost billions of dollars through subprime predatory lending practices. It's the extraction of wealth from properties and all the rest of it that's been very, very important, which tells us something else. That actually capital accumulation from 1970 onwards has had a real problem finding a place to go which is highly profitable. In spite of China opening up, in spite of all of the end of the Cold War, in spite of all of that, a lot of money has not gone into productive activity at all because the rate of return was very low, partly because of heightened competition. The rate of return was much higher when you started to trade in asset values. And asset markets always have a Ponzi character to them. You invest in the stock market, and so the stock market goes up. And so other people say, hey, that looks a good idea. Let's invest in the stock market, and it goes up even further. So all asset markets are inherently bubble-prone, Ponzi-like structures. And that is true also, of course, of land and property markets. So this time around, we have, if you like, a major crisis which arises around the question of rent extraction and land values. Now again, traditional Marxist theories don't actually integrate that into their structure. So what I'm arguing here in a very, very broad sense is, and appealing for, is a different way in which we might understand how crises form. That these form at these different points, but we cannot actually continue to say the only interesting question is how the surplus is produced. Marx did a brilliant job of deciding that. And then, of course, there's a minor question about how it gets distributed. No. We have to think about the manner of distribution, which plays a crucial role in the organization of production, and how the reinvestment function gets partitioned between going into productive activities and going into asset value markets. Now, if you understand the issue that way, then you would look at the current situation and you say, how is the capitalist class and the party of Wall Street, as I call them, that controls Congress, which is both in the Democratic and in the Republican Party, how does the party of Wall Street and the capitalist class aim on getting out of this particular crisis? Well, they are not abandoning the asset value structure argument. They're not abandoning that at all. In fact, one of the things they're doing in New York City, for example, is that J.P. Morgan is warehousing all kinds of plots of land. Waiting for 10 years' time, they hope the thing will turn around. So they're just warehousing it, picking it up at very low value and warehousing it and waiting for and this is, in fact, rental extractions of this kind become absolutely crucial. You could not understand what was happening in, say, East and Southeast Asia in 1997-98 without seeing this as both an extraction of wealth through financial institutions, predatory practices of financial institutions, but also an extraction of wealth that was associated with property and land markets and the like. So these, it seems to me, are key issues we should be thinking about. And I'm not. I realize I'm going very much against the grain of a lot of conventional Marxist thinking on crisis and how crises form and all the rest of it. But until the left, I think, figures out a new way of understanding where crises come from, but also how capital moves to move them around. The danger for the left is you just figured out what the last crisis was about and you apply your theory to the next crisis when capitalists has moved it around. Capital historically has been extremely flexible and fluent in the way in which it is engaged in this process of what Schumpeter called creative destruction. And it does this creative destruction periodically again and again and again. And in fact, crises are fundamental to the reproduction of capitalism. They are what I call the irrational rationalizers of an irrational system. And they become absolutely crucial. So we shouldn't get beguiled when we go through these periods when, so unbelievable statements by Ben Bernanke in 2005, something like that, saying the credit markets are so organized now as to guarantee that there will be no major global disruptions. Well, he's just announced that we're coming out of the crisis. I hope his prognosis right now is better than that one was. But I mean, this is, if you like, the way in which it seems to me we should be really, really thinking about it. Now, as I've said, there's a lot of complicated issues that arise in this, and I've not dealt with all of the complications, and they come the wrinkles are quite difficult. But that is the outline, if you like, of how I would like to think about the current crisis. So let me leave it there so we have a little time for discussion. Thanks very much. Yeah?
So what are the implications for a left strategy?
There again, yes. Well, first off, I've actually, for a long time now, not liked the idea that the factory proletariat is the avant-garde of revolutionary moves. For a long time now, I've been pointing out that events like the Paris Commune, the Seattle General Strike were urban events. The first proclamations of the Paris Commune were banning of night work in the bakeries, but also the moratorium on all rent extractions. So one of the things that we have to do is to overcome, it seems to me, the idea that the only working class which is actually going to produce revolutionary transformation is located in the factories, in the classic kind of way. I've never thought that satisfactory, but I think now is a moment to really say, well, we can't. We have to actually involve all of the people who are caught up in for instance, the production of urbanization and all the rest of it. And people like to talk these days about there's a new configuration called the Precariat or something like that, which is a precarious, insecure labor force. The French like to talk in this way, and the Germans are now talking about it too. But it's always been like that if you look at the construction industries and the railroad navies and all those kinds of things. It's always been precarious labor. So I think that one of the things we have to do is to start to think out, well, one of the questions is what is to be done and who the hell is going to do it where. And I think also there is, when you start to look at rent extractions, and this is not only on land, by the way. I mean, I didn't talk about the emergence of new rentier forms like intellectual property rights, which are absolutely crucial right now. I mean, there are corporate heads in this country who are kind of saying, we don't even bother producing anything anymore, we just want to hold the intellectual property rights, and then we're just going to sit there and live off the rents forevermore, so the US is becoming more and more, so there's a sort of rentier. So we've got to learn to fight across a number of different terrains, not only in the conventional factory. It's not all, I'm not saying it's all over there, and I think what happens in China may be absolutely crucial, and I'm no expert on China, but that is sort of crucial questions about how factory labor will organize in areas like that. But we've also got to look at a lot of the other forms of labor which are around and start to think about forms of organization that can confront. At the end of the day, the other issue is, for me, the big question which has to be asked is to try to actually confront the perpetual growth of capital at a compound rate. That is, we've got to find out ways to appropriate the surplus and utilize the surplus in radically different ways, and that has to be the political project. And so again, I think the left has to, instead of fighting rearguard actions, against gentrification here or dam construction there, or has to actually start to think more broadly about what a global strategy would be to control the production and distribution of surpluses in the way it is. Because if you don't control the reinvestment function, you're going to be in these asset markets again and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of strategy there. And again, it's going to take a lot of collective work to figure out what sorts of strategies are going to work. I mean, I just finished a book on this called The Enigma of Capital, where I try to talk at the end of some of the strategic ways in which we can address this question. But again, you have to do it on the basis of the nature of the social movements that exist around right now. Of course, a lot of the social movements are organized in NGO form, and frankly, even though there are fantastic people in the NGOs, revolution by NGOs, no way. And of course, there are the traditional political parties, but then there's a lot of kind of autonomista organizing going on and anarchist organizing going on with a very different kind of model, which is sort of horizontal rather than vertical. I'm very sympathetic to actually quite a lot of that, but I think they're self-limiting when they kind of say we don't want to touch a hierarchy of any kind. And you ask a simple question like, how are you going to manage all those nuclear power stations out there through horizontal anarchist communes? And there comes a point where I think it gets too self-limiting in terms of its ideological configuration. But I think also the historical left is also too self-limiting in the way that it's really thought about who are the agents of historical change and where they're located. And you have to respect organizations like the Zapatista movement, which made a lot of. In other words, we've got to think about broad coalitions and alliances between very different movements located in many different parts of the world with many different issues. And that is not necessarily an easy thing to do. It's the sort of thing the World Social Forum has tried to address in some ways, and I think that it's very important to pursue those lines. But there's a lot of work to be done to be able to do that. Yeah.
I think more people on the left would agree with the analysis you gave than you might be assuming. But I wanted to ask a question about going forward.
Yeah.
At the end, you seem to suggest that at least the bankers were hoping to restart the same process through which they made so much money by warehousing real estate and hoping to get property values up again. I wonder your reaction to the view that history shows that whenever a particular form of capitalism, such as the neoliberal form that we've had for several decades, once it enters a period of structural crisis, there's initially an attempt to revive it, but that's not what has happened historically. If you think that this form of, do you think neoliberal capitalism really has become unviable as a way to promote capital accumulation, then you would think that the crisis will continue for some time until some efforts are made to create a new form of capitalism with its own new limits. I wonder what you, and that is relevant to how forces of the left should try to operate.
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball on all of that. I mean, yeah, right now, again, it depends a little bit on how you interpret neoliberalism. I regarded it as a strategy to consolidate and orchestrate class power, and it did it with a rhetoric about markets and and state and blah blah blah. I don't think the capitalist class right now is, as it is. I don't think it's prepared to give up any of its power, and to the degree that the state during this neoliberal period has taken as its mission what I see as two crucial things. One is to rescue financial institutions at all costs. It's continuing to do that. And to the degree that also it saw its mission as creating a good business climate, whatever that meant, I don't see them stopping doing that either. In other words, I think the way I interpret neoliberalism, those foundational principles are going to carry forward. What's been lost is the legitimation that free markets and all this, all of the ideological smoke screens that they threw up there are lost. So to me, it seems that we're likely to move into what I would call a legitimation crisis of the system, but it may take 2 or 3 years to get there. In exactly the same way the stock market crash of '29, it took until about 1932, 33 before kind of really the things really. So I think the powers that be are very aware of that, and I think what they're trying to do is to come out of it well enough to not allow the legitimation crisis to really unfold. Our task, it seems to me right now, is to really hit hard on the illegitimacy of this system, and how the capitalist class is prepared to reproduce itself at the cost of you, me, the environment, and everything, And so this seems to me to be a moment where we really should be concentrating our attacks on the legitimacy of the system.
Maybe over there, and then Ruby.
I think that, like, in talking to people about all these different parts of the crisis, I think it's also really important to talk about what the basic engine that's driving it, because if we didn't have a system where, people, it's hard to think of the system as competitive when things are so unequal that it's not really competitive anymore. But theoretically, it's competitive, and I think of it as like a monopoly game, where it's getting more and more concentrated in wealth. But the thing that I think is important about it that most people don't talk about so much is that it's set up to be that way. And we all know that, but I think the general public, and even a lot of activists don't know that. And a lot of activists, I think, what you said about growth in the beginning, I think explaining why it has to keep growing is a major thing. Many activists are always saying, like they think of it as this, like one corporation to become a good corporation, or, like why can't we have good capitalism, as though you could have a bunch of companies just staying still and all being good, in the midst of the other people doing their thing. So I think, like the most fundamental part is, the fact that it's set up where people are supposed to fight with each other, and people are supposed to the end result is supposed to be inequality, because you can't have anything other than inequality. And if you didn't have that huge amount of inequality, then a lot of the other parts of it that you mentioned, like the discussions of where to invest the surplus, the reason that it's so messed up and skewed is that the people making those decisions have all the money and power. So I think how it got that way is like the basic thing to look at in addition to the different parts.
Maybe we would like to let the lady by the aisle who's been raised. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, it seems to me like the criticism we're making of capitalism isn't necessarily just a criticism of capitalism, because what you're saying is that there are limits. So I don't know if you want to, just to fantasize for a second, instead of a left party or a labor party, we ought to have a limits party. And I don't know how politically popular that could be, but it seems to me that what you're saying is there are limits, and nothing that tries to ignore those limits or circumvent them is going to work.
I don't think. Let me just treat it. Like, for me, there's a big difference between growth and development. It seems to me there's no limit to human capacities for development.
I would agree with that.
But there are limits to capitalism, growth of capital. And say actually the way in which people are trying to solve the growth problem of capital is actually destructive of human capacities and powers, and that therefore is destructive of the possibility of human development. And I think that's, to me, the limits lie over there, they don't lie over here, and so I kind of want to switch, if you like, the conversation from growth to development.
Okay, just quickly, this gentleman.
Do you see the capitalist class as one unit, or is there not a level and differences within that class? For instance, finance capital was not as strong in the Big Depression of 1929. It was the industrial capitalists and the banks that had the problems. And from the 60s on, when the big multinational corporations developed, the finance groups in the capitalist class got the upper hand, and they were directing the investment of capital behind the scenes. Now, we stopped them for a while with the Glass-Steagall Act, when they were regulated. But when that was eliminated, we don't know how they've been functioning, but they've been controlling the investment of capital and the growth of the system as a whole, and the destruction of some systems, like sending all of our labor overseas, and shifting the capital movements overseas, where they just make the money and don't care much about their holding property, and we don't even know what some of their contracts are with the derivatives. So I see the capitalist system as being stymied in further development of the forces of production by the fact that the finance capitalists don't want to put their money into high-tech and new investments, and would rather just go along with what is really destroying the planet. So I think we have to differentiate now and then center our attacks on those who are getting away without regulation, and that means a big democratic movement and exposing it.
We have time limits. And
I'm finished.
Yeah. Okay, good. So you can just wrap up.
Yeah, okay, well, no, I mean, the question of who is the capitalist class and so on, again, yes, there's fractions. I really don't know how to quite interpret the power structures that exist in a country like China and what they're doing. I don't think that it's not a simple kind of question. And there are factions, the financiers and the industrialists and so on, but there's a lot of overlap between them. And I think if you look at the political control exercised in, say, the US Congress by what I call the Party of Wall Street, and how they operate, I mean, I think we should actually form a political party which is called anti the Wall Street Party in Congress, which includes people like Charles Schumer. I mean, frankly, it's well implanted in the Democratic Party. So I think that there is a class configuration there that is become very significant, I think, exercising its power in the current circumstances, and I think that a lot of it does lie in the central banks. I mean, one of the demands made in the Communist Manifesto is for the centralization of the means of credit in the hands of the state. I think we're coming to the point where actually, instead of living under the dictatorship of the proletariat, we're likely to be living under the dictatorship of the world's central bankers. And, with the states controlled by a very narrowly defined capitalist class. I mean, I think the power of the Federal Reserve and the other major central banks is kind of really, really problematic. So, yes, there are a lot of issues about how the power is orchestrated, whether it's then directed into profitable things, new technologies and so on. Actually, it's been pretty dynamic in terms of technologies over the last 30 years. Or whether it gets put into asset values and building these new derivatives markets and so on, which are just simply speculative Ponzi schemes. Those are strategic questions which they are working on. I don't think it's a matter of regulation, for example. I just like to see the straight outright abolition of all derivatives markets. And the transformation of the banking system into something that simply handles money and simply operates as a public utility, and that kind of way to go. So there are many reforms, it seems to me, that can be structured which are antagonistic to the way in which they are actually configuring their power. But again, I don't think we're united enough in our conceptions and our understandings to be able to really pursue an integrated politics which is going to be really foundationally class-based right now. Okay.
Thank you very much.